The carriage rattled through the last ridge of the moors at dusk, and the girl inside it pressed her fingers together in her lap and told herself, very quietly, that she was not afraid. She had been afraid for 3 weeks. She had been afraid from the morning. Her uncle unfolded the letter across the breakfast table and said, without preamble, that the matter. She had been afraid through the journey north, through the grey middling towns and the sheep-cropped hills, through the inn at Harrogate, where the landlady had looked at her plain brown travelling dress and her small portmanteau, and said nothing at all. She had decided somewhere in the last 20 miles that fear was an indulgence she could not afford. She was going to Ashvale. She was going to be the wife of the Earl of Ashvale, who was called the Beast of the North, and she intended to meet whatever waited inside that house with her chin level and her hands still. Her name was Cecily Morrow. She was 22 years old. She had no fortune, no connection, and no mother living, and the only thing she possessed in any quantity was the stubborn, quiet habit of enduring what could not be changed. The house appeared at the crest of the hill, without ceremony. It was vast and dark against the pewter sky, a long stone facade with narrow windows and a pair of torches already lit against the coming night. It was not the ruin she had half expected. It was simply severe, the way a fist held too long in a glove might be, and it sat on the Yorkshire moors as though it had been there since before anyone thought to name the county. The carriage stopped. A man came down the steps to open the door, a broad-shouldered steward in a dark coat, with a lamp held at his side. He said nothing about the hours it had taken her to arrive, nothing about the cold, nothing about her luggage, which amounted to a single trunk, and the hat box that sat on the seat beside her. He said only very correctly that the Earl was expecting her, and would she follow him inside? She followed him inside. The hall was warm. That was the first thing she registered, and it surprised her. A fire burned in a stone hearth, the size of a doorway, and the light it cast was the color of amber, and it made the stone walls look almost kind. There were dogs. 2 enormous greyhounds lying before the fire, long-bodied and grey, who lifted their heads when she entered and then set them down again. A pair of children's muddy boots had been left beside the staircase newel, and someone had set a vase of late autumn rose-ships on the hall table. She had expected cold. She had expected austerity, carried to the point of punishment. She had not expected to feel, in the first 30 seconds, as though the house were quietly alive. He was not in the hall. The steward, who gave his name as Hawthorne, led her to a sitting room off the corridor, and told her the Earl would be down presently, and asked whether she wanted tea or something stronger, and when she said tea he seemed pleased by the choice. The fire in the sitting room was smaller, but it was real, and the chairs beside it were worn to a softness that bespoke long use. A child's drawing had been tucked, half forgotten, between the candlestick and the wall. She was looking at that drawing when she heard him come in. If you are with us for the first time, stay close. What Cecily saw when she turned that evening was not at all what anyone had led her to expect, and the distance between the story and the truth of him is the whole shape of what comes next. He was large. That much was accurate. He stood 6 feet and more, with shoulders that filled the doorway in a way that was not aggression, but simply fact. And his face was the kind of face that Yorkshire weather makes in a man who spends a great deal of time in it. He had dark hair that wanted cutting, a jaw like pale granite, and eyes the color of February sky. Very still, taking her in with a gravity that was not hostility. He was perhaps 34 or 35. His coat was plain and well made, and had a small tear at the left cuff that had been mended with dark thread and was not quite invisible. He carried the day's work in his posture, the slight tiredness of a man who had been outdoors since first light. He said, "Miss Morrow." His voice was low and unhurried, not what she had expected. She had expected command. What she heard was something closer to care. She said, "My lord." He gestured toward the chair nearest the fire. And then when she had sat, he sat opposite her rather than standing over her, which she noted without fully understanding why she noted it. "You had a long journey," he said. "I did not mind it," she said, which was not quite true, but was the polite answer. You will be cold still. Hawthorne will bring the tea. He paused. The greyhounds had followed him in and arranged themselves at his feet, and he reached down to touch one on the ear without looking, the gesture utterly unself-conscious. I want you to know, he said, that the terms of this arrangement are yours to examine and revise. I have a solicitor in York. He will speak with you before anything is signed. I want you to understand what you are agreeing to. She looked at him for a moment without speaking. They told me you would not permit that, she said. My uncle told me the terms were not negotiable. Something moved across his face. She would learn. In time to read his face precisely to catch the small variations it permitted. What she saw in that first moment was not anger, but something nearer to resignation. The look of a man who has heard one more time something he had long suspected. Your uncle was mistaken, he said. The dismissive label had reached Cecily Morrow before she ever set foot in Yorkshire. She had heard it at her uncle's table, from his wife, from her cousin Arabella, who wore pink muslin in November and had opinions about everything. The girl bound to the beast of the north, they said, poor creature. No one would choose that arrangement, and yet here she goes. No fortune, no prospects, no alternative. And so she goes. She had heard it again at the posting inn, where the innkeeper's daughter had whispered it to the cook, not quite softly enough. And she had read it between the lines of the letter her uncle had shown her, the one from the Earl's man of business, which spoke of suitable candidates in a register that reduced her, very efficiently, to a matter of supply. She had decided on the long road north that the label would not be the last word. She had no expectation of rescue. She had only the habit of her own quiet refusal to be less than herself in whatever room she occupied, and she intended to apply that habit to a marriage on the Yorkshire moors the same way she had applied it to her uncle's house and to her father's death, and to every other room that had told her, in its furnishings and its silences, that she did not quite belong. What she had not prepared for was the drawing on the wall, the mended cuff, the dogs, the way he said your uncle was mistaken with the flatness of a man who sees the thing clearly. The tea came, and with it a plate of biscuits, and he did not speak again until she had warmed her hands on the cup, which she did without embarrassment because the sitting-room was not so warm as all that, and she was cold from the road. He watched her warm her hands, with no expression she could read except attention. There is a child, he said, my ward. She is 8. Her name is Edith. She is at present asleep, but she will be at breakfast tomorrow, and she may attempt to question you about London, which she has not visited and about which she has extensive theories. Cecily said, I have not visited London either. He looked at her with an expression she could not quite identify. Good, he said after a moment. Then you may theorize together. The formal arrangements were not concluded until 3 days after her arrival. This was not by Cecily's design, but she understood, gradually, that it was by his. He gave her 3 days in the house before the solicitor was called up from York. He gave her 3 days in which to learn its rooms and its rhythms, its hours of meals, and the names of the servants, and the way the moors changed color through the morning windows. He gave her 3 days in which to decide whether she could bear it. What he did not give her was access to his interior. He was present at meals. He answered questions directly and briefly. He did not condescend to her, and he did not flatter her, and he did not explain himself. And when she asked, on the second morning, whether the dogs had names, he said, Frost and Bramble, in that order, and then went back to reading the letter in his hand. The letter was from York. She saw the seal. She did not ask about it. On the second afternoon, she found Edith. The child was in the library, which was on the north side of the house, and cold enough that the child had wrapped herself in what appeared to be a curtain. A heavy blue velvet affair gathered around her shoulders, and she was sitting in the window seat, reading a natural history with the curtain puddled around her, and her dark hair entirely escaped from its ribbon. She looked up when Cecily came in, and she looked at Cecily with her godfather's February eyes. And she said, "Are you the lady who is going to marry my guardian?" Cecily said, "That is not yet certain." Edith seemed to find this answer satisfactory. She said, "Good. He says one should not make things certain before one has thought them through. He makes me think things through before I am certain about them. It is very annoying." She looked back at her book. "Do you know anything about barnacles?" Cecily sat down on the window seat opposite her and said that she knew very little about barnacles, and asked what the book said. She was still there when the Earl came to find them an hour later. The light had shifted and the library had grown dimmer, and she and Edith had moved closer together over the natural history. And Cecily was reading aloud a passage about migratory patterns in the herring, which Edith had decided was the most important fish in the North Sea, and about which she required complete information. He stood in the doorway. She did not know he was there for some time. She became aware of him only when Edith glanced up and said, without surprise, "We are learning about herrings," and then returned her attention to the book. He stood there a moment longer. She felt him looking at her, though she did not look up. She felt it the way one feels a change in the weather, a slight shift in the air pressure of the room, warmth from a direction she had not been facing. Her hand turned the page. She said to Edith that there were 3 things the book said about the spawning cycle, and she would like to try them in order, and her voice came out steady, which it should not have done, given what she felt in the skin at the back of her neck. He withdrew without speaking. She heard him close the door, very gently. Later that evening he left a second lamp outside her bedroom door. She found it when she went to bank the fire in the corridor. There was no note with it. There did not need to be. She stood in the passageway a long moment with the lamp in her hands and felt something shift in her chest that she did not yet have a name for. The solicitor came on the 3rd day and spent 4 hours at the house. And Cecily sat at the dining room table with the documents spread before her and read every line, which took longer than Mr. Pemberton had perhaps anticipated. He was a patient man, and he waited. And when she asked a question about the disposition of her personal effects in the event of her death, he answered it without inflection. And when she asked a second question about her rights of residence if the marriage proved unworkable, he paused and looked at the Earl, who had seated himself to one side of the room with a ledger in his hands, and who said without looking up from the ledger that Miss Morrow was to have whatever assurances she required on that point, and that Pemberton should amend the clause. Pemberton amended the clause. She signed the document that afternoon, with the low Yorkshire sun coming through the windows, and the greyhounds asleep on the floor, and the Earl signed beside her, and Pemberton witnessed it, and the thing was done. He said after Pemberton had departed, "I want to show you the gardens before the light goes." She followed him outside. The gardens were large and formal, and had gone slightly wild in the way that gardens do, when they are tended faithfully but without love. The box hedges shaped but not clipped to severity, the gravel paths clear but scattered with autumn leaf. He walked beside her, not behind her and not ahead, which she noticed. She said, "Why me?" She had intended to wait longer before asking it, but the like was almost gone, and the question had been in her for 3 days. He was quiet for a moment. They walked past the rose arbor, leafless now, its canes tied back against the stone wall with rough cord. Edith needed someone, he said. Someone who would see her, and not manage her. I had had 2 governesses in the past year who saw her as a problem. I wanted someone who would sit in a cold library and learn about herrings. He paused. I did not know that was what I wanted until I saw it. She said nothing. I did not, he said more quietly, expect to have any want of my own in the matter. The garden was nearly dark. The first stars were out. The things they say about you, she said. The name. The beast. I had thought it would be colder than this. It was colder, he said, before she looked at him. He was looking at the bare rose canes, his profile very still against the darkening sky. My wife died, he said. It came out without weight, or with all of it compressed to flatness. 4 years ago it was winter. The roads were bad and I had let her go to her sister's without me, and she did not arrive. They found the carriage on the 3rd day. He stopped. I had kept her waiting while I finished work in the study. I had told her the visit could wait another week. She said she was tired of waiting. He did not look at her. She was not wrong. The silence between them was complete and cold, and not unkind. "I am sorry," Cecily said. "I became the beast," he said simply. It was easier than being the man who had made his wife wait. He turned finally and looked at her. The last light was behind him, and she could not fully read his face. "I have no intention of making anyone wait again. I want you to know that." She understood. Then, the lamps. The solicitor called before the ink was dry. The documents amended on request. The 3 days' grace before any signature. She understood, and the thing she had felt in the corridor with the lamp in her hands sharpened from warmth into something more precise. They went back inside. The house was lit for the evening, and it was warm, and from somewhere upstairs came the sound of Edith practicing scales on a pianoforte that needed tuning. If you have stayed this far, you know the shape of what is coming. The winter is long, and the moors make isolation into something almost intimate, and two people in a house together have nowhere to hide what they are. The first weeks of the marriage were formal and careful, and inhabited by a mutual courtesy so complete that Cecily sometimes thought it had its own temperature, something between winter and spring, not warm but not hostile, waiting. She took over the household accounts on the 14th day, at the housekeeper's quiet invitation, and she found that she was better at them than she had expected. Mrs. Calder, who was 53 and had run Ashvale Hall for 11 years, watched her work through the first morning's entries without comment, and then in the afternoon brought her a second ledger and explained that this one concerned the home farm. She worked through it. There were inconsistencies in the feed costs that suggested someone was marking up the grain by a small but sustained percentage. She went to the Earl. He was in the study, and he was reading the same letter she had seen 2 days before, with the York seal. He looked up when she came in, and he rose, which surprised her still, the automatic courtesy of it, and she laid the ledger on his desk and pointed to the entries. He looked at them. He looked at her. "How long?" he said. "At least 2 years, possibly 3. If this second book starts, where I think it starts," he said. "I had not looked at those accounts in 4 years." There was a silence. "I know," she said. He looked at her for a longer moment than was strictly necessary for the exchange of information. She was aware of how close the desk was, and of the angle of the winter light through the study window, and of the fact that his hand was on the same ledger she had just touched, 2 inches from hers. "Thank you," he said at last. The words were simple. They were the words of a man who had been managing alone for 4 years, and had simply, in this moment, not been managing alone, and who was saying thank you the way one says it, when what one means is something considerably more than gratitude. She went back to the household accounts. He resolved the grain matter within a week, which resolved it quietly and without visible severity. But the man in question did not appear in the farmyard again, and Mrs. Calder gave her a look of complex approval the following Monday morning. Christmas came to Ashvale with all the formality the season required, and slightly less warmth than Cecily had hoped for, which surprised her, because the house itself was warm enough. The difficulty was that the Earl's mother was in residence from the 20th until the 6th of January, and the Dowager Countess of Ashvale, who bore the name of Lady Prentice by remarriage and who preferred to use it, had views about Cecily that she conveyed with the precision of someone who had spent 50 years practicing the polished wound. Lady Prentice was not a cruel woman. She was a woman whose script had worked everywhere else. Her son's first wife had been an Alderton, from a county family with 4,000 acres, and a baronetcy on the maternal side, and the Dowager had chosen the match herself, had considered it the best work of her social career, and had mourned it accordingly. She had expected her son to find his way in time to another Alderton. She had not expected a Morrow. She had in particular not expected a Morrow from the West Riding, without fortune or connection, whose uncle kept a modest house, and who had arrived at Ashvale Hall in a hired chaise with a single trunk and a hat box. At dinner on the second evening, in front of the Alderton cousin she had brought with her, the dowager said, "I had always thought Alderton's girl would make a fine mistress of this house," in a tone of such perfect social neutrality that only Cecily heard the architecture of it. Cecily said nothing. She served herself from the dish at her elbow and sat up straight and ate her dinner. At the carol service in the village on Christmas Eve, the dowager said to the vicar's wife, just far enough from Cecily not to require lowering her voice, that it was a difficult situation. A man like the Earl, a house like Asheville, managing with so little to work from. The vicar's wife, who was a sensible woman, looked briefly toward Cecily, and then looked away, which was its own kind of answer. It was a difficult sort of Christmas, and it would have been worse, except that Edith had decided Cecily was essential to every one of her plans, and Edith's plans were numerous. There was a pageant she intended to put on for the servants on 12th night. There was a very specific goose she had named and intended to spare. There was the matter of the pianoforte, which, now that Cecily had sat beside her on the bench for 3 evenings running, Edith had decided ought to be played as a duet, despite neither of them being sufficiently skilled for a duet to be anything other than a combined act of optimism. He watched them at the pianoforte on Christmas evening. She had retired early, and the Alderton cousin had gone with her, and the 3 of them were alone in the drawing-room with the fire built high and the candles on the pianoforte, and Edith's determined attempt at a carol that required more fingers than either of them had managed to deploy simultaneously. He sat in the chair beside the window and he watched them. Cecily did not look up. She felt his attention as a specific warmth, the way the fire was warm at her back, directional and real. Edith played a wrong note and said, "Oh, bother," and tried again, and got it right on the 3rd attempt, and looked up to see if he had noticed. And he had. "Well done," he said. "Cecily showed me," Edith said, which was not entirely accurate, but was the kind of thing a child says when she wants 2 people to understand that they are connected. The house felt different when the dowager departed on the 6th of January. It felt lighter. The greyhounds extended themselves fully across the hearth-rug. For the first time in a fortnight, and Hawthorne brought a very good claret to dinner, without being asked, which, Cecily came to understand, was his way of marking the occasion. That evening the Earl asked her with some awkwardness that sat oddly on him whether she played chess. She said she did, more or less, which was true. He said less was fine. He would prefer an opponent with imperfect strategy to a game he already knew the end of. And he got the board out and they sat at the table by the fire and played until 10:30. He won. She did not find this objectionable. He played the way he spoke, carefully and directly, and without the kind of ornamentation that obscures intention. She lost a bishop very early through a lapse of attention and said, "I beg your pardon," to the bishop, which she had not meant to say aloud. He looked at her. He had a very particular look. She had learned that appeared when something had struck him as unexpected and not unpleasant, a slight softening around the eyes, a barely perceptible quality of arrested attention. It appeared now. "An apology to the bishop," he said. "It was an error on my part," she said. "It seemed appropriate." He looked at the board for a moment, and then he moved his knight in a way that returned her bishop to the game, which was not strictly legal and which she knew she should refuse, and she picked up the bishop and set it back on its square, and neither of them said anything about it. It was February when she first understood what had been accumulating since October. She knew it in the kitchen garden of all places, where she had gone in the early morning with her hands in thick gloves to assess the winter damage to the kitchen beds which had been poorly mulched, and which Mrs. Calder wished to reorganize in the spring. She was crouching over a row of what had been leeks when she heard him come around the corner of the wall, and she turned, and she was so completely unprepared for the sight of him in the early light, his dark coat and his cold breath visible in the February air, and his eyes finding her immediately, that she felt her chest do something it had not done before. It was not alarm. It was the opposite of alarm. He had come to see about the wall, which had a stone that wanted pointing. He had not known she would be there. He stood for a moment in the gap in the wall with the pale morning behind him, and then he came across the frozen grass and crouched down beside her to look at the leek bed. And they were very close together, their breath making small clouds in the cold, and she could smell wool and winter and something that was simply him. And the feeling in her chest refused to become anything more manageable than what it was. "The parsnips will come up," he said, inspecting the adjacent row. "The leeks will not," she said. "No," he said. They were very close. She was aware of his shoulder at the edge of her vision, the bulk of it, the warmth that she was not quite touching. She looked at the ruined leek bed and said nothing else, and neither did he, and the silence was not comfortable, but it was not cold. After a moment he said, very quietly, "Cecily." It was the first time he had used her name. She had been Miss Morrow in this house, which was correct, which was the right form, but her name in his voice was a different thing, a thing that moved through her like the chord she and Edith could not quite manage on the pianoforte, the one that required a reach neither of them had perfected. She turned and looked at him. He was very close. His face was grave and still, and his eyes were that pale February color that she had been learning to read for 4 months, and what she read in them now was want, plain and quiet and not disguised. "I did not expect," he said, and stopped. He looked at the ground for a moment, and then back at her. "I find that I would like very much, if you are willing, to sit in this garden with you when the leeks come back." It was not a grand speech. He was not a man for grand speeches. She understood completely what he meant. "The parsnips are coming back sooner," she said. The quality of arrested attention appeared in his face. And then, slowly, something else, something she had not seen before, something that undid the controlled gravity of his expression from the inside. She thought, this is what they were hiding. Not a beast, not a cold man and a stone house, and a life of managed endurance. This, which had been here the whole time under the February sky, waiting for someone to sit in the garden long enough to find it. He reached out and very carefully, with the back of 2 fingers, touched the side of her face. Just that. The wool of his glove against her cold cheek. Her breath left her entirely. And did not return for a long moment. "The parsnips," he said, his voice very low. "Will do." The spring came early to the moors, or early enough, with the snowdrops in the kitchen garden by the end of February, and the first crocus in the formal beds by the 3rd week of March, and the pianoforte tuned at last by a man from York who arrived on a Tuesday and spent 6 hours on it and declared it fit. And Edith celebrated by playing the same carol she had been attempting at Christmas, which now came out with all its correct notes, and she looked to see if Cecily was listening. And Cecily was. She came again in April, because the dowager's social calendar brought her north in spring as reliably as it brought her north at Christmas. And she arrived with a different cousin this time, the unmarried daughter of an Alderton relation, a young woman of 20, named Miss Frances Alderton, who was handsome and well-dressed, and who wore a shade of pale blue that did very well for her complexion. She said to Cecily at the receiving end of the first evening, "I had not imagined anyone would have taken on such a position, with so little preparation." She smiled when she said it, which made the word position do what it was designed to do. Cecily smiled back, and said that she found herself very well suited to it. Hawthorne, who was pouring wine at the sideboard, poured with great precision, and did not look up, which was his way of listening. It was, again, a difficult visit. She's agenda was clear enough. Miss Frances Alderton was here to remind the Earl of the alternative that had always been available to him, and the Dowager assisted this program with the delicate persistence of someone who has decided that a piece of furniture is in the wrong room and intends to move it eventually through the application of consistent redecoration. She said, at breakfast on the 3rd morning with Miss Alderton at her right hand and Cecily across the table, that it was a shame the hall did not see more company, that Cecily must find it rather quiet, that some women are suited to society and some to solitude, and that one must hope to find the temperament appropriate to one's situation. Edith said, "Cecily taught me how to rearrange the kitchen garden," with the irrelevance of a child who has not followed the subtext, but has identified a friend who requires defending. There was a short silence. The Earl said, "She did." He was looking at his cup. "The parsnips are already up." He said it with a complete flatness of tone that no one at the table, including the Dowager, could productively interpret. He set down his cup and asked Hawthorne for more coffee and returned to his newspaper, and the moment passed, and Cecily understood that she had been defended without anyone being able to name the defense. But the Dowager's program did not pause, and by the fifth evening, it had arrived at its destination. After dinner, while Cecily was in the library with Edith, who had been permitted to stay up until 9, the drawing room received the Dowager, and the Earl and Miss Alderton, and Cecily could hear through the wall the particular quality of the Dowager's voice, at its most authoritative. She did not hear the words. She did not need to. She went on reading to Edith. The story was about a fox family. Edith had opinions about the fox cubs. Cecily read steadily and clearly, and she did not listen at the wall. Because what happened between the Earl and his mother in the drawing room was not something she could change, and she had learned, in 22 years of rooms that did not entirely want her, that one does not spend energy on what one cannot change. Edith fell asleep against her arm at 8:30, which was earlier than 9, and Cecily sat in the library with the sleeping child heavy on her shoulder and the Fox family at a critical juncture, and the fire very low, and she did not move because the child was asleep and the fire was warm enough and the arm was tired but not unbearably so. He found them at 9:15. He stood in the doorway as he had stood the first time, and looked at her in exactly the way he had looked then, and she looked back, and Edith slept between them on the window seat. He said very quietly so as not to wake the child, "I had a conversation with my mother this evening." "I know," she said. "I told her," he said, "that the young Alderton is a very well-suited young woman who would do very well for someone else entirely." He paused. "I told her that I had found, to my considerable surprise, that I did not wish for someone else entirely." The fire had dropped to embers. The library was dim. "She was not pleased," Cecily said. "She was not. She will in time decide she was." He came into the room and lifted Edith very carefully from Cecily's shoulder, the child settling against him with the bonelessness of deep sleep. "She has been wrong before. She corrects herself eventually." Cecily stood. Her arm came back to itself slowly. "I am going to take her up," he said, the sleeping child against his chest. "And then, I would like to come back and sit with you for a while if you are not too tired." She said she was not too tired. He came back, and they sat by the dying fire for an hour, and they talked about things that were not the conversation in the drawing room, and not the future, and not the past, but simply the present, the Fox family and the kitchen garden, and whether Edith would actually manage to spare the goose again this coming autumn, and she felt, for the first time since the hired chaise had rattled north in October, that the present was entirely sufficient. He said near the end of the hour, with the fire very low and the room almost dark, "I have been thinking about the east garden. There is room for a reading bench against the wall, where the sun comes in the afternoon." She said she thought that was a very good use of the wall. His hand was on the arm of the chair between them. She put her hand over it, which was not a thing she had planned to do. She felt his knuckles under her fingers, warm and real, and he turned his hand so that his palm was against hers, and held on. She departed on the 9th day, which was one day earlier than planned, and the young Alderton went with her. Hawthorne brought the very good claret again. Edith appeared at dinner with a ribbon successfully installed in her hair for the first time in 3 weeks, and announced that she had decided the goose should be named Clementine, and that this made it significantly harder to serve it with anything. The Earl said that it was generally difficult to serve things one had named. Edith looked at Cecily. Cecily looked at the Earl. He looked back at her, and what she saw in his face was exactly what she had begun to look for. The thing under the granite, the warmth he kept very well contained except when he did not. the particular quality of his attention when it settled on her, which was not the attention one paid to a situation, but the attention one paid to someone one had not expected to find and did not intend to lose. Summer came in, and Ashvale sat in the moors differently in summer. Less austere, the gardens loose with color, the windows left open to the moorland air. Cecily had been in the house 9 months, and she knew its hours the way one knows the hours of a place that has become one's own. The way the light moved across the hall floor in the morning, and the particular sound the front gate made in the wind, and the smell of the library in wet weather, and the place on the third stair that protested underfoot. She knew him too, in the accumulated way of 9 months in close proximity to a person who tells one very little outright and a very great deal by the way he moved through his own house. She knew the letter he kept in the inside pocket of his coat which she had never read, and about which she had asked nothing. And she knew that he went to the churchyard in the village, alone on the 14th of November, which was the date of the carriage. She knew that he could not sleep in high wind, because she heard him on the stairs at 2 in the morning when the wind was loud. She knew that he watched her, with that quality of arrested attention when she did not know she was being watched, which she always eventually knew. She knew and had known since February what was underneath. She had not found the courage to name it, and neither had he. And the summer was passing. It was August, and the evening light on the moors was that specific amber that belongs only to the north in late summer, when she went to the churchyard to find him. She did not do it on the 14th of November. She did it on an ordinary Tuesday evening in August, because she had understood for some time that the grief he carried was not a wall but a door, and that a door requires someone to open it. He was at the grave. The stone was plain and well tended, a woman's name and 2 dates and nothing else. He stood with his hands behind his back and his hat in his hands, very still, the way he was still when something moved him more than he intended. She came and stood beside him, close enough that their sleeves almost touched. He did not speak for a long moment. Then he said, "I should have told her more often that I was glad of her." Cecily said, "I expect she knew." "Probably," he said. "I was not very articulate about it." She looked at the stone. The evening light was very warm on the gray granite. "You leave a lamp," she said, "outside the door. You gave me 3 days. You moved your night back." He was quiet. "You are more articulate than you know," she said. "It is simply a different language." He turned and looked at her, and she looked back, and the amber light was in his eyes and on his face. And he looked at her the way he had looked at her since October, with the disguise finally entirely absent, the want of it plain and grave, and completely unhidden. "Cecily," he said. She did not say anything. She waited. He put his hand on her face as he had in the kitchen garden, not the back of his fingers this time, but his palm, cupping her jaw with a care so complete that she felt it in her whole body, and she turned her face into his hand, and he bent his head and kissed her very gently, a kiss that was a question and a promise at the same time, and she answered it. And they stood in the churchyard with the amber evening around them, and the moors quiet as held breath. He said, against her hair, "I find that I love you." "I wanted you to know it plainly," she said. "I know it." "I have known it for some time," he said. "I am sorry I was slow." She said, "You were not slow. You were careful." He held on, and the light changed, and the evening turned to dusk. And somewhere on the moors a curlew called and fell silent, and Cecily stood in the churchyard of a village on the Yorkshire moors, with her face against the coat of a man she had married in fear and come to love in fact, and she thought of the hired chaise rattling north in October, and the stone facade against the pewter sky and the lamp left outside her door, and she felt the whole length of it like a thread from then to now, and found it good. The reading bench went in against the east wall in September, and the sun came in the afternoons exactly as he had said it would. She sat there with Edith's natural history when the weather allowed it, and sometimes he brought his correspondence out and sat beside her, and the greyhounds lay in the grass, and the moors went on forever in every direction, and the house behind them was warm. Edith spared the goose. She named it Clementine, and it lived beside the kitchen garden for 3 more years, and was never served with anything. The first real snow of the winter came in November, early, and covered the moors and the gardens and the roof of Ashvale Hall in a silence that was not cold but only still. And Cecily stood at the sitting-room window in the evening, and watched it fall, and heard him come in behind her, warm through the wool of her gown. "The parsnips are in," he said. "I know," she said. Outside the window the snow fell on the rose arbor, and on the east wall, and on the churchyard, at the edge of the village, and on every field of the moors, gentle and thorough and without exception, covering everything that had been worn, and everything that had been cold, and everything that had been waiting, and making it quiet, and making it clean. If you have stayed until the end, thank you. Leave a comment and tell us which moment you knew. The fire is still burning at Ashvale.